I sat there in the church pew, my hands gripping the funeral program so tightly that it crumpled in my palms, as my Uncle Richard stood at the podium and announced to everyone gathered that my father had signed over his $1.4 million construction business to him 6 months ago. I'd worked alongside Dad for 17 years, building that company from nothing, and he'd promised me it would be mine someday. That was June 2018, and I was 58 years old. The memorial service was supposed to be a celebration of Dad's life. He'd passed away suddenly from a heart attack at 73, and the whole community had turned out. Dad was beloved in our town, known for his integrity and for treating his workers like family. The church was packed with contractors, suppliers, employees both current and former, and neighbors whose homes Dad had built over the decades. I'd spent the last 3 days in a fog of grief, making arrangements, picking out Dad's favorite blue suit for the burial, writing his obituary, calling everyone who needed to know. My daughter Sarah had flown in from Seattle with her husband and kids. My son Michael had driven up from Charlotte. They'd been so worried about me, knowing how close Dad and I had been. We'd always been close. I was his only daughter, the middle child between my 2 brothers. Richard was 10 years older than me, and my younger brother Tommy had died in a car accident when he was 22. After Tommy's death, Dad and I grew even closer. We understood each other's grief in a way that others couldn't quite grasp. When I graduated high school in 1978, I'd planned to go to college. But Mom got sick with cancer that summer, and everything changed. I stayed home to help care for her while Dad worked. She fought for 2 years before she passed in 1980. I was 20 years old. After Mom died, I thought I'd finally go to college. But Dad was struggling, working himself into the ground, trying to keep the small construction crew he'd started a few years earlier afloat. He was drinking too much, not eating right, showing up to job sites late. I couldn't leave him like that. So I started helping out in the office, answering phones, doing the books, handling invoices and payroll. I was good at it. Within a year, I'd organized the chaos of Dad's filing system, implemented a better scheduling process, and started bringing in bigger jobs by learning how to write compelling bids. Dad would come home from job sites and find me at the kitchen table with spreadsheets and blueprints spread everywhere. He'd pour himself a whiskey, sit down, and we'd talk through the projects. Where we were losing money, where we could expand, which clients were trouble. By 1985, we'd grown from a crew of 5 to 23 employees. We weren't just doing home repairs anymore. We were building custom homes, commercial renovations, small office buildings. Dad's reliable construction became the name everyone knew. Richard barely came around during those years. He'd moved to Florida in 1976 to work in real estate. He'd call on Christmas and Dad's birthday, sometimes. He never came back for Mom's funeral, said he couldn't afford the plane ticket, though Dad later found out he'd just bought a new boat. Dad was hurt but never said much about it. That was his way. In 1987, I got married to Frank, a Finnish carpenter who worked for us. Dad walked me down the aisle and gave the most beautiful toast at our wedding about how Frank was getting not just a wife but a business partner, because I'd never be the type to just stay home. He was right. Frank and I had Sarah in 1988 and Michael in 1991. I took short maternity leaves but was back in the office quickly each time, often with a baby in a carrier while I worked. Dad had converted the storage room into a little nursery so I could bring the kids to work. Through the 90s and early 2000s, the business kept growing. We weathered the 2008 recession better than most because we'd been conservative with our finances. Dad always said, "Don't grow faster than you can afford to fail." By 2015, we had 42 employees and were doing over $3 million in revenue annually. Frank and I divorced in 2012. It was amicable enough. We'd grown apart, wanted different things. He wanted to move to Colorado and start his own contracting business. I wanted to stay here with Dad and what we'd built together. The kids were grown by then. Understanding. Dad relied on me more after the divorce. I'd moved into the small house next to his, the one he'd built for Mom, hoping she'd live to enjoy her own space when she got older. He'd never sold it or rented it out. It felt right, being close to him in those years. We'd have dinner together most nights. I'd cook, or he'd grill steaks on his back patio, and we'd talk business. Always business. Who was bidding on what? Labor costs. Material shortages. He'd started talking more seriously about succession planning around 2016. "This should all be yours someday, Sarah," he'd say, using my middle name like he always did when he was being serious. "You built this as much as I did. More even. I just hammered nails. You made it into something real." I'd brush it off, tell him he had years left, that we didn't need to talk about it yet. But he'd insist. "I need to make sure it's official. Get it in writing. Richard's gonna kick up a fuss when I'm gone, you watch." I never understood why he thought that. Richard barely knew the business existed. He'd call once in a while, usually when he needed money. Dad would always send him something. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. "He's my son," Dad would say when I'd gently suggest maybe Richard should stand on his own feet. In January 2018, Dad had a scare. Chest pains that turned out to be angina. The doctor said he needed to reduce stress, lose weight, take it easier. Dad laughed it off, but I saw the fear in his eyes. That night, over dinner, he brought out a folder. "I'm getting old, Sarah girl. We need to make this official." Inside was a draft transfer agreement his lawyer had drawn up. The business would come to me upon his death. There were provisions for a small cash payout to Richard, $50,000, just to keep things fair. But the company, the legacy, that was mine. "I'll sign it next week," he said. "Just wanted you to see it first." But he never signed it. A week later, Richard showed up. Just appeared at Dad's house on a Tuesday evening, said he was in town on business and wanted to reconnect. Dad was thrilled. His prodigal son, finally coming around. Richard stayed for 2 weeks. He took Dad out to dinners, went to job sites with him, asked questions about the business. I thought he was finally showing interest in Dad's life, making up for lost time. Dad was happier than I'd seen him in years. I should have been suspicious, but I wanted to believe Richard had changed. They'd go out for long lunches, just the two of them. Dad would come back talking about how Richard had matured, how he was giving him investment advice, how smart he'd gotten about business. Then Richard went back to Florida, and Dad seemed deflated. But he'd perk up whenever Richard called, which was suddenly often, several times a week. In March, Dad mentioned that Richard had some financial troubles. His real estate investments had gone south. He'd lost most of his savings in some development deal that fell through. "I'm going to help him out," Dad said. "He's my son." I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place to tell Dad what to do with his money. In April, Dad had another angina episode. Worse this time. He spent 3 days in the hospital. I was there around the clock. Richard didn't visit, said he couldn't get away from work. When Dad came home, he seemed quieter, distant. He stopped talking about the transfer agreement. When I brought it up, he'd change the subject. In May, Richard visited again. Another 2-week stay. More lunches, more private conversations. Once, I walked into Dad's home office and found them both there with papers spread across the desk. They stopped talking when I entered. Richard gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just boring legal stuff," Dad said. "Nothing you need to worry about, Sarah girl." That should have been my warning sign. Dad never kept business secrets from me. On June 15th, I was at a job site inspecting the framing on a new home we were building when I got the call from Dad's neighbor. Dad had collapsed in his driveway. The ambulance was on its way. He died before I got to the hospital. Massive heart attack. The doctor said he probably didn't suffer, that it was quick. I felt like someone had carved out my insides with a dull knife. The next 72 hours were a blur of phone calls and arrangements and people offering condolences that I couldn't quite hear through the ringing in my ears. Sarah and Michael arrived. The funeral home, the obituary, picking out flowers. All of it felt unreal. Richard showed up the day before the service, all tears and hugs, talking about what a great man Dad was. I was too numb to do more than nod. The memorial service was beautiful, exactly what Dad would have wanted. Simple but heartfelt. Pastor Williams gave a lovely sermon about Dad's dedication to family and community. Several of our longtime employees got up and shared stories about working with him, about his kindness and his terrible jokes, and his insistence on doing things the right way, even when it cost more. I was supposed to give the eulogy, but I couldn't. My voice just wouldn't work. Michael read it for me, and I cried through the whole thing. After the service, we all moved to the reception in the church hall. People brought casseroles and potato salad and fried chicken. Everyone was sharing memories, hugging, telling me how sorry they were for my loss. That's when Richard stood up on the small stage where the pastor had spoken earlier. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" The room quieted. I thought he was going to share a memory about Dad. I was grateful. I wanted to hear people talk about him, to keep him alive a little longer through their stories. "I know today is about celebrating my father's life," Richard said, his voice carrying across the crowded hall. "But there's something important I need to share with all of you, particularly those of you who work for reliable construction." My stomach dropped. Something in his tone was wrong. 6 months ago, my father and I had a series of long conversations about the future of his business. He was concerned about his health, about what would happen to the company, and all of you when he was gone. I stood frozen by the punch bowl, a cup of terrible coffee going cold in my hand. My father wanted to ensure the business would continue to thrive, and after much discussion, he decided that the best course of action would be to transfer ownership to me. I have experience in business management, in real estate development, in scaling operations. My father knew I could take reliable construction to the next level. The room was silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I want you all to know that I'm committed to honoring my father's legacy. The transition will be smooth, and I'll be meeting with each department next week to discuss the future. People were starting to murmur. Some looked confused. Others looked at me, perhaps wondering if I knew about this, if I approved. I found my voice. "That's not true." Richard looked at me, his expression carefully neutral. "Excuse me?" I said, "That's not true." My voice was shaking, but it was getting stronger. "Dad would never sign the business over to you. He barely spoke to you for 40 years. Sarah, this isn't the time or place." "No, it's exactly the time and place." I set down my coffee cup because my hands were trembling so badly I was going to spill it. "You show up here at our father's memorial service, and you lie to everyone about his wishes? You think I'm just going to stand here and let you do that?" Richard sighed, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I didn't want to do this publicly, Sarah, but since you're making a scene, fine." He unfolded the paper. "This is a signed transfer agreement, dated January 28th of this year. Dad's signature is right here, witnessed by his lawyer, Andrew Morrison." My mind was reeling. January 28th? That was during Richard's first visit, when they'd had all those private meetings. "Let me see that," I said, walking toward the stage. "You can review it with your own attorney," Richard said, folding it back up. "But I assure you, it's all legal and binding." I felt like I was going to be sick. Sarah appeared at my side, her hand on my arm. "Mom, let's go. We'll deal with this later." But I couldn't move. I was staring at Richard, seeing him clearly for maybe the first time in my life. The smile that didn't quite hide the cold calculation in his eyes. The way he stood there, comfortable, confident, like he'd already won. "You manipulated him," I said. "You came here when you knew he was sick and vulnerable, and you convinced him to sign that." "Dad made his own choices, Sarah. I'm sorry you're upset, but these were his wishes." "Liar!" The word came out louder than I intended, echoing across the hall. People were uncomfortable now, shuffling their feet, looking away. "Mom," Michael said quietly, "let's go. Please." Richard addressed the room again. "I apologize for this disruption. My sister is understandably emotional. We'll resolve this privately as a family." The condescension in his voice made something snap inside me. "We will resolve this," I said. "Because a transfer agreement is one thing, but it doesn't override a will. And Dad had a will. I know, because I was there when he signed it 3 years ago. Everything goes to his children equally." For the first time, Richard's composure flickered, just for a second. "The transfer agreement supersedes the will in terms of the business assets," he said. "You'll still get your share of his personal estate. The house, his savings, whatever else there is. We'll see what his lawyer has to say about that. By all means, call Andrew. He's the one who drew up the transfer agreement." That hit me like a physical blow. Andrew Morrison had been Dad's lawyer for 20 years. If he'd drawn up that document, if he'd witnessed it, then maybe, no. Something was wrong. I knew my father. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't lie to me for months, wouldn't let me believe the business was mine when he'd secretly given it to Richard. Sarah and Michael guided me out of the hall. I could hear the murmuring starting up behind us, people no doubt discussing what they'd just witnessed. The scene I'd made at my own father's memorial. I didn't care. We drove back to Dad's house. My house now, I supposed, in silence. Sarah made tea that I didn't drink. Michael paced back and forth across the living room, furious. "What an asshole," he kept saying. "What a complete asshole. At Grandpa's memorial? Really?" Sarah was more practical. "We need to call Andrew Morrison. First thing tomorrow. Get to the bottom of this." But I was stuck in my head, replaying the last 6 months. The transfer agreement Dad had shown me that he never signed, Richard's sudden visits, Dad's weird behavior in those final weeks, distant and secretive. The papers on his desk that day I'd walked in. I got up and went to Dad's office. It was a mess, as always. Dad was brilliant with his hands but terrible at organization. That had always been my job. I started going through his desk drawers, looking for, I didn't even know what, evidence, proof, something that would make sense of this nightmare. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of old blueprints, I found a manila envelope. My name was written on the front in Dad's handwriting, just Sarah. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated June 10th, 5 days before he died. "My dear Sarah girl," it began. I had to stop reading and wipe my eyes before I could continue. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for a lot of things, actually. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. I'm sorry I let Richard manipulate me when I should have stood firm. You need to know the truth. That transfer agreement he has? I did sign it. But I signed it because Richard told me you'd agreed to it, that you decided you wanted out of the business, wanted to start your own thing. He showed me a letter he said was from you, saying you were tired of working for me, that you wanted your freedom. I should have asked you about it directly. I know that now. But Richard was very convincing, and I was so tired, Sarah. My heart was giving out, and I could feel it. I wanted to believe that maybe you did want something different, that maybe I'd been selfish keeping you here all these years when you could have had your own life. But a week after I signed it, I found the original transfer agreement I'd meant to sign, the one giving the business to you. It was in my file cabinet where I'd left it, and I realized that Richard had lied. You'd never written any letter. You'd never wanted out. I confronted him on the phone. He denied everything at first, then admitted it when he realized I knew. He said he needed the money, that he'd lost everything, that he was desperate. He begged me not to revoke the agreement. He cried, "Sarah!" My grown son cried and told me he'd end up homeless without this. I told him I needed time to think, that we'd talk when he visited next month. But I don't have next month, I can feel it. So I'm writing this down, and I'm going to put it somewhere you'll find it. You always could find anything in this mess of mine. The agreement Richard has is legally valid, I'm afraid. Andrew drew it up based on what I told him at the time, and I signed it in his presence. But it was obtained through fraud, Sarah. Richard lied to get me to sign it. That matters legally. There's more. In my safe, there's a flash drive. The combination is still your mother's birthday, 1945. On that drive are recordings. I started recording my phone conversations with Richard after I realized what he'd done. I needed proof. I needed something to protect you with. He admitted everything. The fake letter. The lies about your wanting to leave. His financial problems, which are worse than he even told me. He owes money to people. Serious money. He was planning to sell the business as soon as I died. Use the proceeds to pay off his debts. Use those recordings, sweetheart. Fight him. Don't let him steal what you built. Don't let him destroy what we created together. I'm so sorry I failed you in this. I was weak when I should have been strong. But I'm trying to make it right now, in the only way I have left. You are the best thing I ever did, Sarah. Not the business, not the buildings we put up. You. You are my legacy, and I'm so proud of you. Love always, Dad. I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed like I hadn't let myself sob since I'd gotten the call that he was gone. Sarah and Michael came running at the sound and found me there on the floor of Dad's office, holding his last words to me. Michael read the letter first, then Sarah. When they finished, we just sat there together for a long time. The safe, Sarah finally said. Where is it? It was in Dad's bedroom closet, hidden behind his winter coats. I knew the combination, had always known it. We'd laughed about how he'd never changed it from Mom's birthday, said it made him feel like she was still protecting his important things. My fingers shook as I turned the dial. 1945. Click. Inside were the usual things. His will, the deed to the house, some savings bonds he'd bought when I was born, and a small black flash drive with a piece of tape on it. On the tape, in Dad's handwriting, it said, insurance. We went back to the office and plugged it into Dad's old computer. There were 4 audio files, dated from April and May. I hit play on the first one. I don't know what you're talking about, Richard. Dad's voice. God, hearing it again nearly broke me. Come on, Dad. We both know Sarah's been wanting to leave for years. She told me herself at Christmas. Richard's voice, smooth and persuasive. Sarah didn't come to Christmas. You didn't come to Christmas. Okay, fine. It was in a letter then. Look, the point is, she's ready to move on. You're holding her back. The guilt of leaving you is eating her alive. I need to talk to her about this. No, Dad, you can't. She made me promise not to tell you. She doesn't want to hurt you, but she's miserable. She's been miserable for years. There was a long pause on the recording. I don't believe that, Dad said, but his voice was uncertain. I have the letter right here. I'll send you a picture of it. Read it yourself. The recording ended there. The second file started with Dad speaking. His voice was harder now. I found the original transfer agreement, Richard. The one leaving everything to Sarah. The one dated the same week you showed up here with that letter you said was from her. Dad, did you write that letter yourself? Silence. Answer me. Yes. Richard's voice was quiet now. Yes, I wrote it. But Dad, you have to understand, I'm desperate. I'm going to lose everything. I owe people money, serious people. And if I don't pay them soon, so you lied to me. You made me believe my daughter wanted to abandon me, wanted to abandon the business we built together. I'm sorry. God, Dad, I'm so sorry. But I didn't know what else to do. You wouldn't just give me the money. Because you never pay it back. I've been bailing you out for 40 years, Richard. This is different. This is life or death. These people, they're not kidding around. If I don't come up with $1.2 million by September, I don't know what they'll do. My stomach turned. $1.2 million. He was going to sell Dad's business for his gambling debts or whatever hole he'd dug himself into. The recording went on. Richard pleading and making promises. Dad sounding tired and overwhelmed. It ended with Dad saying he needed time to think. The third recording was from 3 weeks later. Richard had called, asking if Dad had made a decision. I'm going to revoke the agreement, Dad said. I'll give you $200,000 to help with your debts, but the business stays with Sarah. That's final. Dad, please. $200,000 isn't enough. I need the whole thing. Then you'll have to figure something else out. I can't. Don't you understand? I can't. I'm sorry, son. But I won't destroy your sister's life to save you from your own mistakes. Richard's voice went cold. If you revoke that agreement, I'll fight it. I'll drag this out in court for years. I'll make sure Sarah never sees a dime. You'd do that to your own sister? To save my life? Yes. The recording ended. The fourth and final file was from June 8th, a week before Dad died. Richard's voice again. Just sell me half the business then. Let me be a partner. I'll take out a loan against my share, use it to pay off my debts. No bank will loan you money against a business you don't know how to run, Richard. Then co-sign for me. No. Dad, please. I'm begging you. I'll do anything. I'll move back here. I'll work for you. I'll learn the business. Just please. I gave you my answer. 200,000, and that's all I can do. There was a long silence. Then Richard spoke again, his voice different, flat. Fine. Keep your money. I'll figure it out on my own. Richard, I have to go. The call ended. I sat back from the computer, my mind racing. The last call was from June 8th. Dad died on June 15th. 7 days later. Do you think? Michael started, then stopped. No, I said quickly. Richard's a liar and a manipulator, but he's not a murderer. Dad's heart was bad. The doctor had been warning him for months. But even as I said it, a small, terrible voice in my head whispered, "Are you sure?" I pushed the thought away. I had to focus on what I could prove, what I could use. "These recordings," Sarah said. "They prove Richard committed fraud to get Dad to sign that agreement." "Will they hold up in court?" Michael asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "But there's something. They're proof that Dad knew he'd been tricked, proof that he wanted to revoke the agreement." "We need a lawyer," Sarah said. "Not Andrew Morrison. Someone else." I called my friend Margaret, who'd handled my divorce. She listened to everything, then gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in estate disputes. "Call him first thing Monday," she said. "Don't talk to Richard or Andrew Morrison until you do." That weekend was the longest of my life. I barely slept, just kept replaying the recordings, rereading Dad's letter. Sarah and Michael stayed with me, which I was grateful for. I don't think I could have been alone. Richard called Saturday afternoon. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail. "Sarah, we need to talk about the transition plan. I'd like to meet with you Monday morning at the office, go over the accounts, the current projects. I know you're upset, but this doesn't have to be adversarial. We can work together on this." The condescension in his voice made me want to throw my phone across the room. Monday morning, I met with James Hendricks, the attorney Margaret had recommended. He was maybe 45, sharp-eyed, all business. I showed him everything. The letter, the recordings, the original transfer agreement Dad had shown me. He listened to all 4 recordings twice, making notes. "This is good," he finally said. "This is very good. The recordings establish fraud in the inducement. Your father was tricked into signing the transfer agreement based on false information. That makes the agreement voidable. So we can get it overturned? Possibly. We'll need to move fast. File an emergency injunction to prevent your brother from taking any action regarding the business until this can be litigated. Based on these recordings, I think we have a strong case. How long will this take? Could be months. Could be a year or more if he fights hard. Estate litigation can drag on." My heart sank. I can't run the business for a year without knowing if it's even mine. "You won't have to. The injunction will maintain the status quo. You'll continue running things as you have been, and he can't interfere until we resolve this." "What if he tries to sell it anyway?" "He can't, not legally, not with an injunction in place. And if he tries, he'll be in contempt of court." We filed the paperwork that afternoon. By Wednesday, we had a court date for the following week to argue for the emergency injunction. Richard was furious. He called me 6 times Thursday. Finally, I answered, "You can't do this, Sarah. I'm not doing anything except protecting what's mine. It's not yours." Dad signed it over to me. "Under false pretenses. I have the recordings, Richard. I know what you did." There was a long silence. "What recordings?" "Dad recorded your phone calls after he realized you'd lied to him. All of them. You admitting to the fake letter. You begging for money. You threatening to drag this out in court if he revoked the agreement. Everything. Those recordings were made without my consent. They're not admissible. This is a one-party consent state. Dad didn't need your permission to record his own phone calls." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'll fight this, Sarah. I'll tie you up in court for years. You're welcome to try. Those people I owe money to, they're not patient. If I can't pay them, then you shouldn't have lied to our father and tried to steal his business." "It's not stealing if he signed it over to me." "He signed it over because you made him think I wanted out. That's fraud, Richard, and fraud voids a contract." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "I'm your brother. You stopped being my brother the day you decided your gambling debts were more important than Dad's legacy. I could go to the press. Tell them how you're trying to cheat me out of what Dad wanted me to have. Go ahead. I have the recordings. I have Dad's letter. I have the original transfer agreement that shows what he really wanted. Who do you think they'll believe?" He hung up. The court hearing was tense. Richard showed up with Andrew Morrison, who testified that Dad had been of sound mind when he signed the transfer agreement, that he'd explained the implications, that everything had been done properly from a legal standpoint. Then James played the recordings. I watched Richard's face as his own voice filled the courtroom, admitting to fraud, begging for money, threatening Dad. He went pale, then red, then pale again. The judge listened to all 4 recordings without interruption. When they finished, she looked at Richard with open contempt. Mr. Thompson, did you knowingly provide false information to your father in order to induce him to sign the transfer agreement? Richard's lawyer started to speak, but the judge cut him off. I'm asking your client, counselor. Richard swallowed hard. I may have misrepresented some things, but my father signed that agreement voluntarily. After you lied to him about his daughter's intentions and emotional state. After you fabricated a letter purporting to be from her. Your Honor, the transfer agreement itself is legally sound. The agreement may be legally sound, but it was obtained through fraud. That makes it voidable. She looked at the papers in front of her. I'm granting the emergency injunction. Mr. Thompson is prohibited from taking any action regarding the business or its assets, pending resolution of this matter. Miss Thompson will continue operating the business as she has been. We'll schedule a full hearing for 6 weeks from now. Richard stood up. Your Honor, I need to object. Your objection is noted and overruled. This hearing is adjourned. We walked out of the courtroom, and I felt like I could breathe for the first time since Dad's memorial. That went well, James said. But this is just the first step. We still have to get the agreement formally invalidated. What are our chances? Good. Excellent, actually, with those recordings. But I want to investigate something else. What? Your father's death. The timing bothers me. I stopped walking. You think Richard had something to do with it? I think it's worth looking into. Your father died a week after telling Richard he wouldn't revoke the agreement but also wouldn't give him the full amount he needed. That's convenient timing for Richard. It was a heart attack. The doctor said. I know. I'm not suggesting Richard killed him directly. But stress can trigger cardiac events. If Richard was pressuring your father, harassing him, threatening him in those final days, we only have recordings through June 8th. But your father's phone records might show additional calls. And if Richard made threats, if he caused your father undue stress that contributed to his death, that could be relevant both to the civil case and potentially criminal charges. My stomach churned. The thought that Richard might have, even indirectly, caused Dad's death. Look into it, I said. Over the next 2 weeks, James subpoenaed Dad's phone records. What they showed made me feel sick. Richard had called Dad 11 times on June 14th, the day before he died. The calls ranged from 2 minutes to 47 minutes. Dad had also called Andrew Morrison 3 times that day. James managed to get a copy of Andrew's notes from those calls. Dad had been asking about the process for revoking the transfer agreement, about whether Richard could really tie things up in court, about how to protect me. He was trying to fix it, I said, reading through the notes in James's office. Right up until the end, he was trying to protect me from Richard. We still couldn't prove exactly what was said in those 11 calls on June 14th. But at the full hearing 6 weeks later, James laid out the timeline. Richard's fraud, Dad's discovery of it, his decision to revoke the agreement, the escalating calls, and then Dad's fatal heart attack less than 24 hours after the last call. Your Honor, James said, even if we set aside the question of whether Mr. Thompson's harassment directly contributed to his father's death, the fact remains that the transfer agreement was obtained through deliberate fraud. The recordings make that clear, and the evidence shows that Mr. Thompson Sr. was actively working to revoke that agreement at the time of his death. Justice requires that his true wishes be honored. Richard's lawyer argued that Dad had had weeks to formally revoke the agreement and hadn't, that the recordings showed Dad was conflicted but ultimately had let the agreement stand. But the judge wasn't buying it. The evidence shows that Mr. Thompson Sr. signed this agreement based on false information provided by his son. That constitutes fraud in the inducement, which voids the agreement. Furthermore, the recordings make clear that Mr. Thompson Sr. intended to revoke the agreement and was in the process of doing so when he died. I'm ruling in favor of Miss Thompson. The transfer agreement is hereby declared null and void. Richard slumped in his chair like someone had cut his strings. Additionally, the judge continued, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation of potential fraud charges against Richard Thompson. That got Richard's attention. He sat up straight, his face going white. Your Honor, that's not necessary. It's not your decision, Mr. Thompson. You committed fraud against your dying father. Whether criminal charges are warranted is up to the DA, Not you. 3 weeks later, the DA filed charges. Fraud, theft by deception, and forgery for the fake letter from me. Richard tried to make a deal, tried to argue that it was a civil family matter, tried everything. But the DA had the recordings, had Dad's letter, had evidence that Richard had attempted to defraud his father out of more than $1 million. Richard eventually pleaded guilty to felony fraud in exchange for the other charges being dropped. He got 18 months in prison and 5 years probation. He was also ordered to pay restitution, though I knew he didn't have any money. That was fine. I didn't want his money. I just wanted him to face consequences for what he'd done. The day of his sentencing, I sat in the courtroom and watched him be led away in handcuffs. I thought I'd feel triumphant or vindicated or something. Instead, I just felt sad. Sad for Dad, who'd loved his son despite everything. Sad for the family we could have been but never were. That evening, I went to Dad's grave for the first time since the funeral. I'd been too angry, too busy fighting, to visit before. But now, with everything settled, I needed to tell him. "I did it, Dad," I said, standing there in front of his headstone. "I fought him, and I won. The business is safe. Your legacy is safe." I pulled out his letter, which I'd been carrying with me every day since I found it, and read it one more time. "You weren't weak," I told him. "You were a father who loved his son, even when that son didn't deserve it. You tried to make it right in the end, and you did. The letter, the recordings, they saved everything." I stayed there until the sun started to set, just talking to him like we used to talk over dinner, about the business, about the kids, about my plans for the future. I honored Dad's wishes in every way that mattered. I kept the business going, grew it even. I made Michael the foreman of our largest crew, and when Sarah decided to leave her tech job in Seattle, I brought her on as our CFO. We hired 2 more project managers and started taking on bigger commercial projects. 3 years after Dad died, we broke ground on our largest project ever, a new community center in Dad's name, the Richard J. Thompson Community Center. Because despite everything, despite what Richard had done, Dad had loved him, and I could honor that love even if I couldn't forgive Richard's betrayal. I never spoke to Richard again after the sentencing. He served his time, got out, moved somewhere down south. I heard through distant relatives that he'd declared bankruptcy, that his life was a mess. Part of me felt bad for him. But mostly, I just felt relieved that he was gone. The business Dad and I built together is thriving now. We have 63 employees, and last year we did just over $5 million in revenue. Every major decision I make, I think about what Dad would have wanted, what he would have done. And sometimes, late at night in my office, I swear I can feel him there with me, see his cardigan hanging on the back of the chair he used to sit in, hear his voice saying, "You did good, Sarah girl. You did real good." I kept his promise. I didn't let Richard win. I protected what we built together. And Dad's legacy lives on, not just in the buildings we construct or the business that bears his name, but in the way we treat our workers like family, in the integrity we bring to every job, in the values he taught me during all those years we worked side by side. That's what matters in the end, not the money or the property or who gets what in the will. What matters is the legacy of how you lived, how you treated people, what you built that lasts beyond your own life. Dad taught me that. And I'll make sure it's what I pass on to Sarah and Michael when my time comes. The business will go on, the legacy will continue, and somewhere, I think Dad is smiling.